This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and I'm with Miki Dezaki, and he's a Japanese-American filmmaker who was teaching in Japan and decided to do documentaries and YouTubes about the situation of racism in Japan. And he also began to investigate the issue of comfort women who were sexual slaves and the story about comfort women. And his film, Shusenjo, is the main battleground of the comfort women issue, has been shown around the world and is about the issue of comfort women. So welcome to WorkWeek.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So maybe you can talk about how you ended up in Japan and what you were doing there and some of the things that you did there that brought you to the production of this film.
So, I mean, I've been to Japan off and on for 10 years now, first as a study abroad student, and next as a teacher, and then after that I went to grad school. So this time for grad school I did a graduate school project, and it happened to be a documentary film on the comfort women issue, and it's kind of led me up to what is where we're at right now.
So you did some YouTubes about the thinking about racism in Japan. And maybe you can talk about that experience, because you found out that a lot of people believe there was no racism in Japan, and that's one of the things you investigated as a teacher.
Right, so that was very interesting to me, because even living in Okinawa at the time, Okinawan people have faced a lot of discrimination from mainland Japanese people, and they didn't really have the word for the discrimination that they were facing. So when I would ask teachers and students whether they think there's racism in Japan, they would say, no, we don't have racism in Japan. That's an American thing, basically. And when I started teaching the teachers about racism, they were like, you know, you could see all the lights going off. And then also when they asked me, or they said that I could teach this class on racism for my last class of my career as a teacher there, and I taught it and they liked it. And the shocking thing was every time I asked the students in the class whether or not they thought there was racism or discrimination, any kind of discrimination in Japan, there were only a few people who raised their hands. And this is not like because they don't like raising their hands or anything. They actually do usually raise their hands and stuff, but the only kind of discrimination that they thought there was in Japan was against handicapped people. And this is because it's taught in elementary school, I think elementary school and junior high school, that you know, we have to be nice to handicapped people. But other than that, they have no idea really about the discrimination that goes on, ethnic discrimination that goes on in Japan, even though Okinawans face it themselves. Right, so they've heard the stories of their grandparents and you know, their family members going to the mainland and not getting rent. They're not.
They're second-class citizens.
Right. So, you know, landlords will say, you know, you can tell an Okinawan by his last name or her last name, and so landlords will say, I'm sorry, we can't, you know, rent this apartment out to you. And, you know, some of them are quite frank about why. They think Okinawans are loud and drunks and, you know, they'll party too much, and so there'll be a disturbance. So it's quite similar to, you know, how minorities would be discriminated against in the U.S. Or not being allowed to rent a place out, I guess.
Well, there has been the historic discrimination against Ainu people in Japan, and also Japanese of Korean descent, or Japanese. What is that all about, and what is that kind of discrimination?
So yeah, I mean, historically, Zainichi Koreans, they came. A lot of them came during the colonization period of Japan colonizing South Korea. Some of them came to just find better opportunities for work, and many of them also were forced into hard labor to basically help with the war. what happened is after the war, many of the Koreans went back to Japan, but some of them felt like Japan was their home because they were supposedly Japanese. But what happened was that they were sort of revoked of their Japanese citizenship, and then Korea wasn't going to give them a citizenship either, so they were kind of in between, in limbo. And so there are still many Koreans who live in Japan. They're called Zainichi Koreans, which just basically means living in Japan Koreans. And they are, to this day, discriminated against. There was an earthquake, I believe it was a Great Kanto earthquake.
1921.
Yeah, the Great Kanto earthquake, when it was blamed. A lot of things, well, I guess the water was poisoned, and people were blaming the Koreans for poisoning the water, and there was just, I guess, these lynch mobs going around in Japan, killing Zainichi Koreans for this. And interestingly, I guess every year for the past, gosh, I don't know how many years, the Tokyo mayor has kind of said a tribute to these victims, but for the past 2 years they have not, right? And so this is kind of how Japan is leaning more towards the right, or forgetting this discrimination. It's not moving towards understanding more of the discrimination. It's trying to forget it, even though it wasn't very conscious of it in the first place. But it's erasing it even more. And
you can't really tell the difference by looks of Zainichi people. I mean, they are Japanese. They speak the Japanese language, and it's really only by name that people really understand that. But with the Ainu people, what is their discrimination about?
So just to touch on the Zainichi, some actually Zainichi Koreans, they have a Korean name and they have a Japanese name. So some of them will choose based off of what they feel comfortable with, what they think they will get less discriminated against or more respected with. They'll use that name. As far as the Ainu go, the Ainu, there's just so few of them right now. Right. I mean, they still do exist, but there's so few of them, and it's only recently that the government is kind of, I guess, trying to say that they respect indigenous people, and I think it might have something.
They're the indigenous people of Japan?
Well, kind of. I mean, I think they are, but. You have, there was just recently some support from the government for the Ainu people, and people say it's basically because of the Tokyo Olympics coming up, right? They don't want to get this criticism that they don't do anything for the indigenous people. But yeah, unfortunately, their culture is dying out, and the language is dying out. There are still some people who really try to hold on to it, but it's unfortunate that Japan has been so good at basically whitewashing cultures, Okinawan and Ainu. I mean, Okinawan is still somewhat holding on to their culture, but it has changed a lot. I've heard from the teachers that I taught with in Okinawa that Okinawa 20 years ago was totally different than Okinawa now.
And the videos you did of the students when you were a teacher, you asked them about discrimination and racism, and they, in the video, said, no, we don't think that there's discrimination.
Right. Yeah. So they didn't really realize what racism or discrimination really meant. And so my lesson on discrimination, racism, was really taking it from like how stereotypes are formed, how they are used, and how it becomes sort of this culture, or like where it gets to a point where we just totally accept certain things as racist, and we don't even realize, or it's not. We accept them as non-racist, even though they are racist. So one example was this word "bakachon camera," which started off as an onomatopoeia. Chon means the sound of a disposable camera. It goes chung, you know, and so baka chon camera basically means baka is stupid, chon is the sound, and then camera. So it's kind of like a stupid, anybody could use kind of camera. And what ended up happening with that word was chon also is a word for Korean people. And so it's like, it's so easy to use, an idiot or a Korean can use it. And it's interesting because on YouTube people will say, that's not what bakachon means, you know, it means just the onomatopoeia thing. But even though something has a root in something, it doesn't mean that it doesn't change into something else. And my argument is always that you know, the NHK, the national broadcasting TV station in Japan, they're not allowed to use that word anymore, right? So they know that it's been used. It's
transformed itself into a racist connotation.
Yes, yes. And so I give these kind of examples to the students in my class, and they really got it. It's, you know, the light bulbs were going off in their head, and
but this is not in their textbooks.
No, not at all, not at all. And you know, at the time I was teaching, I believe, 15 classes, and they had 27 altogether. And the vice principal had come in to see my class, and she asked me to teach it to all the classes. So I taught it to all the classes, and
they became a famous teacher there.
Yeah, they really loved the class, and so I thought after that, you know, maybe this could be useful to, you know, mainland Japanese people as well. You know, Okinawans have some familiarity with discrimination, but mainland Japanese people probably have no connection at all. You know, being mostly made up of majority people. So so I made this YouTube video, and although the YouTube video, it's very short, the class was 50 minutes, you know, as I said, I went through all kinds of discrimination and taught about stereotypes and stuff like that, but the YouTube video is about 6 minutes, and it really just gives examples of discrimination and racism in Japan, and that's when things really blew up.
What happened?
It started off as just like a few comments in the comment section, and then, my gosh, it became like, I think in a couple days there were like hundreds, and then like thousands, and then like I think it's at like 15,000 or something, like comments. It's insane.
So people went off on that video.
Went off on the video, and it blew up. And there was a journalist named Max Fisher who was really interested in this because, you know, in his mind, being an American, he was like, man, this video is really tame. You're not like criticizing Japan, you know, like you're not saying anything that would look like
it's not anti-Japanese.
And just the disproportionate reaction to the video was just shocking to him, and the amount of attacks and threats that I was getting for this video was shocking, and it was shocking to me too. I had no idea that there was this group out there that was like this, and I just felt like this is a whole nother side of Japan that I had not known about. And then
so it woke you up.
It woke me up, and I realized later on, because at that time I wasn't so politically involved, you know, like I cared about racism because I had faced racism. I know about racism.
In the United States, you faced racism.
Yes, 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 yes. And part of my reason for making the video also was because, you know, Asian Americans in the U.S., although we face a lot of racism, it's never really acknowledged in the media or talked about, really. So as a child, I would feel like, you know, if somebody just acknowledged it once, you know, it would really help me out because it would make me feel like I'm not crazy. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like just having some person in power or in media say like, oh, we do believe you. We understand that there is racism, that has some kind of liberating feeling to it. And I thought that, you know, with racism in Japan being such a taboo topic, there must be so many people who are suffering in silence, you know, not being able to say anything because they won't be believed if they do say something. Because so many comments that were on YouTube were like, I've never seen racism, so it must not exist. And it's like, yeah, because you're the majority race, so you haven't faced it, you know. I was right, though, because a lot of Zainichi Koreans since then, even now, come up to me and say, hey, that video really helped me out. Like, it saved me. Like, just to have somebody acknowledge our suffering.
It showed the reality for minorities in Japan who do face racism.
Yeah, and that was a truth that the Japanese neo-nationalists didn't want to be exposed, right? And I was really happy that I was able to do that.
And that brought you to looking at denialism and that whole history?
Yeah, so now I know, like, at that point, I know now that there's this group of people out there who are trying to erase things in issues.
Sounds like the United States.
Yeah, well, in a lot of countries. Yeah, so I started to, I saw this report on Uemura Takashi, who is this former Asahi newspaper writer who said that, or who wrote the first articles on the comfort women issue, and he was getting heavily like threatened and bashed for these articles. And
what did people accuse him of?
They said he lied about the comfort women issue, and so because he lied about it, the whole thing was a lie. So taking him down, and the Asahi newspaper,
which is a big newspaper in Japan.
Which is the biggest, yeah, one of the biggest left-leaning newspapers, taking them down would have meant basically taking down the comfort women issue, right? If you could get Asahi newspaper to apologize for this article that had a little mistake, and the mistake wasn't really the fault of the journalist, it was actually, sorry, Uemura Takashi didn't even write that article. Like, Uemura Takashi was the guy who broke the story, and his article doesn't really have any errors in it at all. But there was another article in the Asahi newspaper that quoted a former soldier who made a false testimony about the comfort women, right?
And what are the comfort women?
The comfort women. The comfort women are, comfort women is a euphemism for these women who were recruited, forced, coerced into a sexual slavery type system during World War II. And the word comfort women is kind of a tricky word, because it sounds very benign in a lot of ways. You're just comforting. And actually, that's sometimes how women were tricked into it, right? Because they thought, oh, we're just going to comfort these men, these soldiers, in ways like, I don't know, maybe singing or dancing or something like that. And yeah, it was basically for sex, mainly for sex. And so...
and this was all over Asia, where Japan occupied.
It's a long story, but yeah. So wherever Japan was occupying in Asia, there were comfort women. There's a map out that was recently put out by a museum in Japan that shows just how widespread the comfort women stations were all around Asia. And not just Asia, but, you know, Papua New Guinea and Australia as well. And so, yeah, it was considered the biggest sexual slavery system in the world up until now. And so...
And I think the former Prime Minister Nakasone actually said that he had helped give some ideas about that for the troops.
I think he helped set up a comfort station, I believe, right? He admitted that. But the thing is that for Japanese people, they don't see it as a bad thing. Comfort stations, right? They see it as a necessary evil, and they see it as just prostitution, right?
And that's what they accuse the women who are in these stations of being prostitutes?
Right, they're just prostitutes who wanted money. And the Japanese government offered them a way to get money. And, well, actually, the Japanese government now acknowledges their involvement, but before they weren't even acknowledging their involvement. They were saying that it was just brokers and independent managers who were managing these comfort stations. But now they do acknowledge that there was government involvement in these comfort stations. But yeah, so it's a long,
it's a long history, and still a debate of what happened and all the issues. So you decided, what made you decide that you were going to do a film on this and have both sides talk about the issue?
Yeah, for me, I think that when I realized how the Japanese media and the Korean media have done a really poor job of covering this topic, it made me think that, oh, if I dedicate, hour and a half or 2 hours to this issue, bring some context, maybe Japanese and Korean people could understand where each other are coming from and not just fight all the time about this issue. Because I think that's where, in my research, I realized that there were just certain things that Japanese people and Korean people did not know, and when they argued about it, because they didn't know about these things, they were just talking past each other constantly. And so, yeah, with the film, I thought I could bring some context, and luckily, it's been pretty good. I mean, the effect has been pretty good.
And I think it's probably the most famous film in the world around this issue of the comfort women.
Possibly, maybe, I don't know. I mean, in South Korea, it's gotten pretty wide release. It was in over 60 theaters nationwide, and then in Japan, it was in over 50 theaters nationwide.
Was there any effort to stop it in Japan?
Yes. Well, I'm getting sued, so...
let's talk about that, because you wanted to have a film that had both sides, without censorship, really, right. Points of view of both sides. Sure. And getting the side that this wasn't really, prostitution, it was something else, right. Meant talking to people who said that this whole idea of denialism was not true.
Yeah, so my goal, one of my goals for the film was to show both sides' strongest arguments, really, and to see whether or not, or to see which one holds, really. And I felt like that could be compelling to hear it from, the dragon's mouth from both sides. And I felt like Japanese people and Korean people were looking for a lot of clarity on the issue from my experience living there. And I was lucky to find that, yes, this film is exactly, it came out at the right time, basically, for both sides. I mean, for Korean people, they had heard about the comfort women issue for so long. They had heard the testimonies, but they were looking for a fresh take on it. They were actually, many people were getting kind of fatigued about the comfort women issue. I think it's maybe like in Germany, hearing about the Holocaust. Some Germans.
But in Germany, the government has decided that they want to have the history out there.
Right. I think it's not a bad thing. It's just, the people hearing it so many times, they do get a little fatigued from hearing about it, and so... But
your film was a little different because it actually allowed the people who say that this was not the case to have a hearing.
Exactly, and so that's why it was kind of fresh for Korean people. They had never heard these things coming from the Japanese neo-nationalists, and actually they had never heard comfort women supporters from Japan. So that was a big thing for them. Because for them, the comfort women issue is like a battle between the nations, right? And when they saw that Japanese activists and scholars were supporting the comfort women, they realized, oh my God, this isn't just a a nation versus nation kind of thing, right? So that was very interesting for me to hear those kind of comments. And then for Japanese people, you know, they're just tired of the Koreans constantly accusing them of this issue. And so they want like a third party. And I'm kind of like a third party because I'm Japanese American, to sort of sort it all out for everybody and clear the air. And so yeah, I think that's it was right timing for Japan and Korea at the, you know.
And your previous videos on YouTube about racism and discrimination were well known. Particularly, they were attacked by right-wing neo-nationalists. Why did the right-wing neo-nationalists or the supporters of the view that there was not comfort women, I mean there was not prostitution, agreed to be interviewed by you?
They agreed. I mean, I approached them as a graduate student and said, I'm listening to both sides of this argument, and I'd like to hear their side. I'm very open to hearing their side. I'm not, and it was totally true that I was not fully convinced of either side at that time. I didn't know that much about the comfort woman issue. I mean, I was like any American, right? You might have read an article or two in CNN, on CNN or New York Times, but you don't know the details, right? And so when you're presented with details, then all of a sudden you start to doubt certain things. And so I would tell them this, and I said, I'm really curious to hear what you guys have to say. And they, you know, they want a platform. They want to be legitimized. I went to Sophia University, which is considered a prestigious university in Japan. So, you know, me coming as a graduate student from Sophia University, saying, I want to hear your take on this, I think they probably felt flattered to some extent. And then the issue now, though, is that they're trying to say that I only told them that it was going to be a graduate school project, which isn't true. I always told them that of the possibility that if the film was good enough, it would be in film festivals and possibly in theaters, right? But, you know, that's totally out of my control. That's up to the people who have that power to bring it into a film festival or bring it into the theaters. So it was. And
they did sign releases.
Of course. I had everybody sign release forms, which is not a common practice in Japan. So my distributor in Japan was like shocked that I had, and thankful that I had the release forms, because yeah, Japanese documentary filmmakers don't think of that because Japanese people don't really sue that much, right? But being an American, I knew of the possibility. I mean, you're supposed to do it for any kind of documentary in the U.S. It's not. It doesn't even matter if it's contentious or not. And so I got release forms, and you know, they stated that there's public release a possibility, and yeah, it's kind of ridiculous that I'm getting sued right now. It's
adding to the publicity about the film, though.
It is. It is. It is. But the concern is in Japan, there is a possibility of them stopping distribution, and that would be a huge, huge knock on freedom of expression in Japan.
And the rise of Abe, like the rise of Trump, have meant an increase in xenophobia. Immigrants have come under attack here in the United States, Asians, African Americans, Latinos. Is the same happening in Japan?
Well, Japan doesn't really have an immigration policy.
Although they want more immigrants for a labor force, there seems to be a declining population, which is forcing them to.
They don't call it immigrants, though. They don't call it an immigration policy. They do have a policy for bringing people in from Southeast Asia and Philippines, but they call it an internship program. And so you're supposed to stay for 5 years and then leave, right? So we use you for 5 years and then you go. So they don't want people to stay in Japan. And this is seen as the ideal for alt-right right-wingers in the US, right? So yeah, the alt-right and Japanese nationalists are you know, in love with each other, I think.
You have Trump, they love Trump. And,
oh, yeah. They love Trump. I mean, a lot of the right-wingers that I interviewed in my film after the election were congratulating me for my new president, you know.
They were very happy about Trump.
They were very happy. They were very, you know, and if you watch the film, you'll see that a lot of them are kind of like Trump in a way, in the way they speak and the way they think. So, yeah, it's very interesting how there are these parallels. Two totally different countries, two totally different cultures, and yet you still have these things that are very similar, like, you know, xenophobia, racism, sexism, that are just accepted by a certain political party.
And there's been an effort by the government to censor the books, not to talk about this issue and other issues, and teachers have been punished for refusing to sing the national songs of the military. Talk about that, the effect of that in Japan. I don't know if that's in the film, but
it isn't in the film. But I mean, it's interesting because Japan, or at least the teachers in Japan, are historically very liberal, and the teachers' unions were the ones who were really fighting against the government whenever it was leaning more towards the right. It's since then become very weakened, but there are still some teachers who refuse to stand for the national anthem in schools. This is not an uncommon practice in Japan. And
why don't they want to stand?
They believe that the national anthem and the flag are a part of Imperial Japan, the time when Japan believed that it was the superior nation in Asia and that it needed to spread its culture and society to all of Asia, right? Fascism, basically, right? And unfortunately now many Japanese teachers have sort of folded under the pressure and now do stand for the flag and national anthem. And
recently there have been some art exhibits that were canceled.
Right. So there was the Aichi Triennale in the summer of 2019. This Comfort Woman statue was displayed, and a lot of people protested against that statue, being shown. And
there were threats?
Yes, sorry, not just protests, but threats. And so the main threat that made the organizers decide to take down the exhibition was basically a fire threat. They threatened to basically burn down the building, which was a serious thing to consider at the time because 2 months before that, Kyoto Animation Studios had been burnt down with people inside of it. So they were afraid of something like that happening again. Unfortunately, organizations in Japan easily fold to or give in to right-wing pressure, and they instead of just finding this man who said this and charging him with these threats, they decide to close the exhibition. And it took a lot of fighting, and I think for the last week of the exhibition they were able to get it up in October. But
now the government says they're going to cut funding to the...
Right. They're going to cut funding. They found a way to cut funding. So it just shows that the government is not, or actually kind of condoned a lot of these threats. Right? They didn't really condemn the threats when they were happening. Right? It would have meant a lot if they condemned the threats and said, look, this is an art exhibition. They have their freedom of expression, right? you know, we have to protect this right because it's important to our Constitution.
It's called a democracy, or what was the exhibit called?
Oh, it was
freedom of expression, I think, or something like.
Right. Well, the Japanese, the English translation is a little different, but basically it was previously censored artwork.
That was the title of it.
That was going to be shown again. You know, it was like after censorship, or I forgot what the name of the. So it was a bunch of pieces of artwork that were previously censored that were going to be on display for the first time in a long time, and ironically it gets censored again, right?
So it's not previous, it's ongoing.
Which is, it was interesting because it was supposed to be maybe a signal to Japan and the rest of the world that Japan is moving in the right direction, saying like, you know, these were censored before because of right-wing pressure, and now we're not going to give in to that. And they gave into it.
It became a big scandal.
It did become a big scandal, and I think it's still going on. I think there's a court case that's still going on. The people who, the activists who supported showing the statue sued, I believe, the city for it's.
They didn't ask the artist; they just canceled it.
Right, they just canceled it. Right. The concerning thing about Japan, though, is that there wasn't an outpouring of support for the exhibition. Right. That was very concerning, and the artists who did pull their artwork from other parts of the Triennale to show solidarity with the artists who were censored, most of them were foreign, not Japanese artists. Japanese artists, most of the Japanese artists did not pull their artwork from the whole art Triennale. So, you know, it is very concerning how Japanese people think about their own rights, right? And what they consider important to fight for. I mean, we have that problem in the U.S. too, right?
Like, I'm going to go to the U.S. because one of the things that's happened here in the Bay Area in San Francisco is, and in Glendale, is that monuments to the comfort women were being constructed.
Right.
And you had some experience with that, and you came to the United States as part of your project to do this documentary. Right. Maybe you can talk about that.
So the statue, so the same actual, not the same exact statue, but the same form of the statue is in Glendale, California, and that has been, I guess, a huge headache for the city of Glendale because there's this fighting between Koreans or Korean Americans and Japanese Americans in the city of Glendale to try to get this taken down, and Japanese Americans actually sued the city of Glendale to get it taken down. Interestingly, that lawsuit was considered a SLAPP lawsuit, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar. It means strategic lawsuit against public participation, basically to shut people up. And
that protects journalists and other people.
Yes, of course, artists. And so the nice thing about the U.S. is that many states have anti-SLAPP laws, and California is one of them, and the court recognized the Japanese American group who sued Glendale as filing a SLAPP lawsuit, and I believe they had to pay $300,000 to Glendale for filing that lawsuit.
Now, apparently the Japanese government foreign ministry has appropriated, some reports, $500 million to go around the world and fight these what they would say anti-Japanese monuments.
I'm not exactly sure how the money is getting divided or where it's getting funneled to, and I've heard it goes through foundations and stuff like that, or it goes to university chairs. But Yeah, I mean, my experience, or what I've heard, is that it's the consulates, the Japanese consulates, that protest or try to prevent statues from coming up or fight against the statues. I just heard from the former mayor of Glendale, Frank Quintero, that he spoke to the current Los Angeles Consul General of Japan, and he told Mr. Quintero that his #1 priority was to get that statue out of there.
That was the biggest task for the Los Angeles Consulate General, and that is to get the statue out of Glendale.
Yeah.
What is that? It seems like, I mean, silly, but also it's kind of backfiring because it's giving more publicity to the whole issue. Is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if they understand what they're doing or what, but I mean, if they had just ignored it, nobody would even know about the Glendale statue, right? Except for like activists, maybe. But yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with my film, right? In a certain sense, maybe not with the government, but with these people who are suing me, at least, I feel like...
Who are they?
There's 5 people who are suing me. They're in the film. One of them is named Kent Gilbert. He's a celebrity and also an attorney in California, but he's been living in Japan for a very long time. He started out as a Mormon, or he first came to Japan as a Mormon missionary, and I believe in the 80s, 70s. And then this guy named Tony Morano, who is also known as Texas Daddy, he is suing me. I mean, you don't really know who these people are until you see the film, but and then there's 3 Japanese people who are suing me: Texas Daddy's manager, a guy named Fujioka Nobukatsu, who is a professor of education, and then Yamamoto Yumiko, who is the leader of this right-wing activist group called Nadeshiko Action. So these 5 people are suing me right now.
And one of the issues is not only that they deny this history, that's their position, it didn't happen, but also some of these organizations have been involved in harassment or attacks on Korean Japanese?
Some of the groups, or that?
Some of the organizations that are involved in denialism themselves have been involved in. Why don't you talk about that, because most people are unaware of that.
Yeah, so the way that it happens often, well, it really flared up in 2013, 2014. They had these big kind of protests or demonstrations with, you know, the imperial flags and signs saying "kill the Koreans" and get them out.
Kill the blacks, or kill the Asians, or that kind of thing. I mean, that's
kill Koreans. That was.
Was that the sign?
Go into like predominantly Zainichi Korean neighborhoods and march with these signs, right?
Kind of like Nazis. Kill the Jews, kill the blacks.
Us going into, you know, Harlem or something like that, or wherever, you know, like is predominantly black, and saying kill black people, right? Like
you're terrorizing the community.
Terrorizing the community, and now we have or hate speech laws that don't allow that, but they still have kind of toned down protests that are similar. Yeah, in 2013, 2014, there were these really big demonstrations, and it was pretty shocking to a lot of people how big they got, right?
How big did they get?
I mean, it's hard to say numbers, but I mean, it was a big crowd.
Thousands? Hundreds?
Well, I mean, Japanese people are not that political in general, so hundreds is more like our big, you know. Yeah, it was shocking to see that. And just because there's a hate speech law that doesn't allow for that kind of stuff to happen doesn't mean those people don't exist anymore or don't think that way, right? So a lot of it comes in the form of online harassment.
And on social media.
Social media.
You face that with your films, your first film.
Right, right.
Were you personally threatened?
Yeah. Well, yes. I was, told to die, and that I was Korean myself, which I'm not Korean. And so, anybody who criticizes, or not, I wasn't even criticizing, but talks about things that they don't want people to talk about is a Korean or Chinese or
against the Japanese people. If you're well, this shoplifters film. Apparently that was also attacked for showing the underside of Japanese.
Right. Yeah. So Shoplifters won the Cannes Film Festival 2 years ago, and it was to show. I mean, there's this view of Japan that there's no homeless people and there's nobody that's poor, but there are a lot of people who are poor in Japan. And Shoplifters shined a light on that kind of situation for people in Japan, and it wasn't very popular, the film in Japan, right?
Not like Parasite, which also shows what's going on for people in Korea, really, the poor and the very wealthy.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? how people just don't want to see the bad sides of their own country. I guess we have some of that in the U.S. as well.
Of course, although it's a lot harder to. Okay.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Couple more minutes.
Well, so you're traveling with the film now at colleges around the my third tour. And what's been the response to the film in the United States? You're internationally in the United States.
Yeah, it's been very good. I think a lot of Americans and Europeans draw parallels to their own countries because the rise of nationalism and the right in countries around the world it's happening everywhere, right? So they draw parallels to the rhetoric that is being used by neo-nationalists, and because the issue touches on women's rights, there are parallels to the Me Too movement and believing in testimony, and I think that people in the U.S. and Europe, it's such a far issue from them, right? So they have to connect it with their own personal kind of experiences and what they know. But a lot of people come up to me and say that they feel like it's a really important issue now, and I do talk about America's involvement in all this as well.
What was that?
Well, I'll let people watch the film. Spoiler alert.
Okay.
But no, spoiler.
There was American involvement, though.
Yes, I think so. I think America has some responsibility with some of this rise in denialism and revisionism in Japan. So that's part of the film.
And your next project?
My next project, I've been beating around a couple of different ideas, and I don't usually like to say anything because I feel like with documentaries, you don't really have a film until you've shot like 50% of it, because you just don't know, even if you had a plan, or even if you had like, oh, I want to interview this person, and they don't give you that interview, it's out of your hands, right? So, anyway, it'll probably be on Japan and some kind of social or political issue.